Great. So, welcome. Lesson 37 we're on here today, and the figure we are looking at is St. Augustine of Hippo. We, in previous lessons, had, of course, covered a biography on one of his contemporaries, St. John Chrysostom. We then looked through 2 weeks at one of his more well-known works, Adversus Judaeos, the first sermon of 8 in that work, and then, as was the plan, we're then finishing off the early church period with one of the other most prominent authors or writers from that time, which is St. Augustine of Hippo. There are many contemporaries during this time which we could go through. Those of Jerome, of course, the most famous translator of the scriptures in the early church. St. Ambrose, the Bishop of Milan, who actually features here today in passing detail. But there are no shortage of others during this time, as we've been covering now into the 5th century with the 3rd and 4th ecumenical councils. We're finishing off this early church period with this final and most seminal and important figure, St. Augustine himself. So, you'll notice on the title page of your notes, as well as on screen for those watching online, there's many paintings and frescoes and other such artwork that has been produced of St. Augustine throughout the ages. This one, if my memory serves me correctly, is a painting from 1645 by a French artist, Philippe de Champagne. This is by far the most famous. One of the most famous paintings of Augustine. It features him as bishop, of course, in his study. Most of the paintings of Augustine feature him in his study for reasons that will become quite apparent to us as we go through the biography of him today. You see him surrounded by the scriptures and many scrolls and various different codices and books of different kinds. There in his left hand, he holds a human heart that is aflame. In his right hand, he holds a quill, right, a pen, the quill which he would write with, of course, in ink. And you'll notice that then in what is the top left corner of the image, you'll see a light coming, as like the sun or that from heaven. And very faintly, you'd have to look more closely into on the image that you actually have either on screen or on your paper, the Latin word veritas, meaning truth. Okay, it's quite faint. It's meant to be by design, and so it's the light of truth or divine truth from God. His mind is also illuminated or inflamed at the back of his head as he gazes at divine truth, and then the human heart is set on fire through the mind. So the truth of God through our minds, enlightening our minds in the true biblical sense, that then sets our hearts aflame in truth. So a whole host of symbology. It's very common with what we've seen in the various different pieces of Christian artwork that we've tried to incorporate through our time thus far in this course on church history, and this is no exception. Many art pieces, and this is probably one of the most famous. And this illumination of the mind and the enlightening, literally the setting aflame of the human heart in its passion for truth, is something that again will become more apparent as we go through what we want to do today, which is a biography of St. Augustine. Before we kind of got into this particular subsection on these last two figures of St. John Chrysostom and St. Augustine, I explained that these two figures, John Chrysostom and Augustine, are the most prolific authors in a generic sense, so be it sermons they delivered or their own writings by hand or by scribes, etc. They're the most prolific authors in the early church period, so that first 500 years of Christianity, by quite a margin. And Augustine stands atop of that mountain. There is no one about whom we know and of whose works we know than this Augustine of Hippo. So we're going to be focusing on a biography today. And like with Chrysostom, it's a summarized biography because Augustine, quite frankly, is one of the single most significant figures in the history of Western civilization. And anyone who has studied ancient history or philosophy especially, at any level, high school or university level, will know, broadly speaking at least, why that's the case. So to do a biography in a full, totalizing, all-encompassing form would take us 3 months at least to do it properly. And there are entire subjects in university courses dedicated to Augustine, not only as a theologian and as a bishop, but also as a philosopher, one of the most important philosophers in the Western tradition. And those courses can and do routinely run years. So by virtue of that, again, and the nature and the spirit of this particular course as an introductory course to church history, the biography here is condensed to this for us today, and then there'll be recommendations that I'll give toward the end of our lesson today, all right? So let's begin on this biography of St. Augustine of Hippo. He was born in his name Aurelius Augustinus in full on the 13th of November 354 in the Roman province of Numidia, which is in modern-day Algeria, so North Africa. Okay, we've obviously seen a lot of church fathers from the east in various places that are today Greece and Turkey and Lebanon and Egypt and Israel, Palestine, etc. Here now, this is actually one of the Western fathers, as they're known, the Latin fathers, right? And he is from North Africa. Okay, born in the city of Thagaste in Numidia. He's known simply, of course, as Augustine, and it's pronounced Augustine. Some modern Americans pronounce it Augustine with the emphasis on the end, but it is certainly pronounced Augustine. So you'll hear me say it that way from this point onward. His mother, who is known, Monica, she was a Christian, but his father, Patricius, was a pagan. Although fortunately for he and for his wife, and of course their son Augustine, he actually converted later on in life on his deathbed. And so that's noted quite evidently from Augustine's own writings. By the time of his birth, that is Augustine, his family had actually been Roman citizens for over a century. There were, of course, plenty of people in the empire who were not citizens. In this case, he and his family were and had been for at least over a century, as the historical records kind of indicate. They were of the particular noble rank or aristocratic rank called the honestiores, which is where we also get the word honour from, honestiores, and the word honest also is where we get the word honest in English from as well. But nevertheless, all you need to understand is this was an aristocratic family, and they spoke Latin at home, which is typical of those wealthier aristocratic families. So he's coming from that particular environment. His father especially was quite well off as well, so there's wealth and there is also noble rank in the family, and that will become apparent kind of for reasons that we'll now explore as we continue onward. He begins his schooling at the age of 11 and was formally educated first off both in Latin and in philosophy, because in the ancient world and even in the modern world up until not all that long ago, we did used to teach children philosophy, and then we decided for some absurd reason that we should abandon it. In this case, he learns Latin and philosophy very early on. By the time he then works his way up to the age of 17, he was quite fortunate, in fact, to actually have a wealthy benefactor, or what's known as a patron, right? So someone who would then sponsor and assist him and fund him in his studies. And because of this patron, he was actually able to move from Thagaste in Numidia over to Carthage, which is also in that broader region, so the ancient city of Carthage. His hometown of Thagaste is nearby, at least broadly speaking, geographically, to Carthage. Carthage, of course, formerly conquered by the Romans in the Third Punic War, famously where it was destroyed long after the days of Hannibal Barca and of Scipio Africanus, and for any of those who are familiar with Roman history. And it had been fully Romanized and eventually rebuilt later on, decades after its great destruction in the in the 2nd century BC, and was now a fairly prominent city in North Africa, just remodeled and entirely Romanized, of course, but was very much, other than Cairo and Alexandria especially, in Egypt, the only other place in North Africa that was of a significant cultural epicenter, especially when it came to education and learning, was Carthage, which had been entirely rebuilt by the Romans themselves. And so he is patronized and begins his studies at the age of 17 over in Carthage, and he continues his education, previously Latin and philosophy, also now adds in rhetoric. We saw that especially with John Chrysostom, his formal, high-level, elite formal training in rhetoric. So in other words, the science and art of what I'm doing right now, speaking publicly, and everything that goes into that. He also expanded his knowledge of Greek and Roman philosophical sources, so his philosophical training was now also deepening to not just the Roman sources but also Greek ones as well. And it was during his time in Carthage there studying that Augustine converted into what was, by the time we're here in this mid to late 4th century, a relatively new religion. It's one of what we call in history, in historical studies, the mystery cults. Okay, and this one was called Manichaeism, as we pronounce it today in English. Relatively young. The empire had, all the way back since its founding under Augustus, was quite full of what we call mystery cults. So what's meant by this term? Mystery cult, kind of as the name suggests, a mystery, mysterion, that which is hidden or that which is secret. These various mystery cults, which came from all around the known world, but especially from the former lands of Babylon and of Persia, right? So what today is Iran, Iraq, etc. The mystery cults coming out of those eastern parts into the empire were one of the biggest sources. Mithraism is one of, if not the most popular of those mystery cults. Mithraism eventually become the worship of the deity Mithra, ends up becoming the default religion of the Roman army. Okay, so the soldiers especially were followers of the mystery cult of Mithraism, and it embedded itself quite heavily and distinctly in the Roman army. Various other ones as well, the Gnostic cults, of course, which some of us are familiar with from the Book of Acts that we've encountered before, etc., etc., etc. This is one of those ones, and a mystery cult, in its essence, like I said, as that name suggests, is a secret esoteric cult that you have to be first initiated into, and then even once you have been initiated, there are kind of various concentric circles of levels and orders that you would rise up through the ranks of, kind of like peeling layers off the proverbial onion, as we might say. And so those who were at the highest level, or the inner sanctum, which is where that kind of term comes from, the inner sanctum, the sanctum, holy place, right? The inner holy place, the inner circle. Those who had the knowledge that had been revealed to them by having progressed to that inner sanctum were far ahead of those who had just been initiated, right? And you had to work and earn your way, or in many cases of some of the mystery religions, pay your way in the form of a tribute toward that. Examples of modern day mystery cults are those of Scientology, for example. So Scientology, despite its considerable efforts to market itself and brand itself otherwise, is a rather boring and bland mystery cult that has done nothing to reinvent the wheel in any capacity. You're initiated into it, and then you quite literally have to pay your way through the various levels and orders all the way up to the biggest secrets that get revealed, and that's where the more asinine and retarded ideas kind of tend to come in. That's a mystery cult, and that's an example of a mystery cult. This is no different. So Manichaeism was founded by, and I'm pointing this out because, again, this actually is quite a pertinent detail to Augustine's story. It's in the name there. It was founded by a prophet named Mani, who was a Persian self-declared prophet, who had brought the final religion, the final testament of God. Manichaeism famously considered Zoroaster, so the founder of Zoroastrianism, otherwise known as Zarathustra, which was the religion of the ancient Persians. It considered Zoroaster, the Buddha, Buddhism founded essentially in the 5th to 4th century BC, and then Jesus as prophets in a line of succession, and then Mani was the last final prophet. Okay, he lived in the early 3rd century, so the early 200s AD, not BC, AD, so about 120 to 150-ish years prior to the time of Augustine. So that's what I mean, a relatively new mystery cult or mystery religion. A very similar claim to what the Arabian warlord Muhammad eventually goes on to make a couple of centuries after this time. The final prophet in the line of prophets that have come before. And so he adopts and converts into this mystery religion of Manichaeism. And we're not focusing on specifically what it believed, but more about how its account kind of features into the story of Augustine himself. So anyway, he's become a Manichaean during his time as a young man in Carthage, is what we need to understand. So continuing on. Between the years 373 and 383, so that roughly 9 to 10 year period, Augustine actually taught grammar and rhetoric in both Thagaste and Carthage respectively. So now he was actually quite a young teacher in his 20s here, and he is teaching, academically speaking, teaching grammar and rhetoric in both of these cities respectively through this particular decade. Afterwards, he then attempts to actually found a school of rhetoric in Rome, a venture which was not actually successful due to mainly the fact that the students that he accrued were quite a rabulous bunch and not really good students at actually sitting down and listening, and so the whole venture just tended to implode. But nevertheless, fortunately for him though, in trying to actually begin an academic career not only in Carthage but now in Rome and toward the heartland of the empire, the prefect of Rome had been given a decree or given an order from the emperor. The imperial court during this time is now actually no longer in Rome. It's now, well, of course, actually the main centre is in Constantinople, like we've seen previously. But in terms of the administrative capital of the Western Empire, the Western provinces, is now in Milan. Okay, so further north in Italy, what today is the Italian peninsula, of course. The imperial court in the west, the administrative court in the west, gives order to the prefect of Rome to fulfil a professorship up in Milan, because again there's a confluence between, of course, appointed positions of significant value and honour, especially in regards to academia that's still functioning during these times in these parts of the empire. Nevertheless, Augustine ends up landing this particular job, and he's appointed as the professor of rhetoric at the school in Milan in 384. And so now, at 30 years of age, he holds one of the most significant and one of the most prestigious kind of academic professorships in all of the empire at the age of 30. His academic background, of course, being educated from 11, he's been taught consistently with an elite education, much like a number of these church fathers that we've seen throughout our time. Justin Martyr, of course, high up there. Athanasius, highly as well. John Chrysostom, highly as well. You're seeing a pattern. This is why we're pointing this out. He too, Augustine, is one of these figures that does great work off the back of significant elite academic backgrounds in the ancient world. So this is where he's now at. He's now in Milan at the age of 30 in a very prestigious tenure in a professorship there in this particular case, of rhetoric in the empire. So, continuing on. Despite having been a Manichaean now for a decade, as I highlight there in your notes, he'd never actually succeeded past the initial kind of entry position into a full-blown initiate, largely due to obstacles and people not actually admitting him into it. As the nature of mystery cults were, they bred, by definition, they would breed an incentive to essentially guard and protect the secrets and esoteric knowledge of the cult. And so the actual initiation of initiates, pardon the term, into the cult was a very slow trickle, not a wide open stream, and this frustrated him greatly. Fortunately, though, this disillusionment actually ends up assisting him later on in his conversion to Christianity, but we'll get onto that kind of as we progress forward. But nevertheless, by virtue of his elite education, he possessed, of course, a profound skill in both rhetoric and philosophy, which only further aided him in his ability to actually rethink Manichaeism on the whole, as well as all the various different competing mystery cults and religions and philosophies. Of course, as we've seen very consistently, especially in some of those earliest lessons where we were spending about, I think, 3 or 4 lessons roughly off memory, just going through some of the history of Rome and of Greece and the culture of the Greco-Roman world or the Hellenistic world. The way in which dozens upon hundreds, really, actually, of philosophical schools from various different strands of Platonism, be it Socratic forms, Aristotelian kinds, the original school of Plato, the New Academy, which actually gets mentioned here in Augustine's story, Neoplatonism, so in other words, New Platonism, which was popular by this time, etc., etc., etc. That's just the Greek side, let alone all the various philosophical schools of the Romans, from Cicero to Virgil to various others whose writings and beliefs were upheld and followed. In this case, his academic background in rhetoric, so in other words, how arguments are formed and how you present concepts and the whole speaking side, undergirded by an elite education in philosophy, is what allowed him to have a very good mind for being able to actually work through logically, literally in the case of kind of capital L logic in regards to philosophy, and discern the veracity or the truthfulness of these various philosophies and ideas. It's exactly why in that image, that painting that we had at the beginning of our lesson, it is veritas, right? Truth, the light of truth. That's something that's a common feature in artwork concerning Augustine, because this is very much that philosophical background kind of coming to the fore and working at play there. And so during his time in Rome, just before moving to Milan, as far as the historical sources indicate, he actually abandons Manichaeism, right? So he ditches that after essentially a decade in the peripheries of Manichaeism, might we say, and embraces a kind of philosophical skepticism, which was quite popular during this time of the late imperial era. Okay, various different philosophies that he studied were ones that called the New Academy, so a type of Platonism, of Platonic philosophy after Plato, of course, as well as just other general Neoplatonic ideals and influences, are things that he's now starting to seriously consider, especially from an academic perspective. And he kind of transitions into this ether, this no man's land, as we might say, of not actually believing something specifically, but a general philosophical skepticism about all the various different beliefs that human beings held during this particular time. However, that actually plays to his advantage later on as we again continue to work through this story of Augustine. So, continuing on. Upon arriving in Milan, now to take up his post as professor of rhetoric there in Milan, he meets another very famous church figure from this time, Saint Ambrose. Okay, Ambrose was the Archbishop of Milan, probably, if not almost certainly, the most famous Christian in the entire Western Roman Empire at this point. He himself was renowned for his mastery of rhetoric. He was also highly educated in rhetoric as well as philosophy. So has a not too dissimilar academic background to Augustine. He was renowned for his sermons, as other contemporaries like John Chrysostom were also. He is certainly the most influential, other than the Bishop of Rome, obviously. He is, after the Bishop of Rome, almost certainly the most influential bishop in the Western provinces of the empire, and that, of course, is quite fitting given that Milan is the administrative capital of the West during this time period. Okay, just like we've seen John Chrysostom in previous lessons, who had been a presbyter in the Church of Antioch, right, an apostolic see, he then is appointed Archbishop of Constantinople, which is the capital of the Roman Empire during these days. It's likewise that same kind of cultural, contextual background that Ambrose, for that reason, finds himself in Milan. But nevertheless, having of course been well aware on the part of Augustine of Ambrose's skill and indeed really mastery as a rhetorician, or as a rhetorician, pardon me, he wants to meet him, he wants to learn from him, he wants to study his work, etc., etc. And so over the years, their friendship blossoms actually quite fruitfully. Ambrose takes this young, relative, 30-year-old guy, highly gifted academic, highly gifted in rhetoric and philosophy, similar interests to him, but who is kind of just wandering aimlessly through the never-ending ether of philosophical skepticism, And just even to point to kind of one thing that Augustine himself says, one of his most famous works is what's known as his Confessiones, or in English, his Confessions, which is his own autobiography. In that, he actually makes reference about first meeting Ambrose and why he wanted to meet Ambrose and the effect that Ambrose had. And just even an excerpt from that, this is what we get for us in the Confessions. This is a reference that comes from Book 5, Chapter 13 of Augustine's Confessions. Quote, "And to Milan I came, to Ambrose the bishop, famed through the whole world as one of the best of men, thy devoted servant." The Confessions are actually addressed to God, hence why they're called the Confessions. And so the thy or the you in reference is he's talking to God, right? So that's where this reference comes in, right? Thy devoted servant. His eloquent discourse in those times abundantly provided thy people with the flour of thy wheat and the gladness of thy oil and the sober intoxication of thy wine. To him I was led by thee without my knowledge, that by him I might be led to thee in full knowledge. That man of God received me as a father would, and welcomed my coming as a good bishop should. And I began to love him, of course, not at first as a teacher of the truth, for I had entirely despaired of finding that in thy church, but rather as a friendly man. Right? Very revealing. Obviously, Augustine is having a discourse with and talking to God. It's a monologue, but addressing God in his Confessions in terms of the posture of this work. He mentions how he despaired of finding any truth in God's church. Of course, that's a position or an opinion which he then later on explains that he, of course, overcame and realised that the truth was only in God's church. But here, especially with that ending of he found a friendly man, he's really kind of revealing something about Ambrose in the spirit of friendship and welcome that, with all due respect, an extremely busy guy, extremely busy man with an extremely prominent position with 10,000 juggling balls to keep in the air at the same time, found place to, I guess you would say, mentor Augustine, the young Augustine, and take him under his proverbial wing. Recognising the knowledge and talent, academic gifting, the brilliance, the intellectual brilliance of Augustine, and though Augustine, not being a Christian at this time, he is friendly toward him, he is accommodating, he becomes a mentor toward him, and that is what begins to steer Augustine toward the path of God. I mentioned at the outset that part of the reason why we're doing an introductory or condensed biography of Augustine in one lesson, not in 3 months in full course, is because Augustine is one of the single most influential thinkers and academics and philosophers, particularly in the history of the West, a position which, by the way, is almost universally agreed upon, whether from Christian academics or secular academics. There is no Augustine without Ambrose. Okay, as he is just aimlessly wandering through this barren wasteland of philosophical skepticism, having become so disillusioned with the religion of his youth. Of course, his mother was a Christian, as we mentioned, but he rejected that initially. He wanders off into a mystery cult, essentially a new mystery cult, so a very in vogue, faddy, as in FAD, fad type of mystery cult that was all the rage at the time, right? And that gained him prominence and respectability and other such things. He becomes entirely disillusioned with its failures because, of course, it failed as a false religion, and in this aimless position he finds himself in philosophically, not really knowing what to believe about anything. He is at this very time, having just very recently abandoned Manichaeism, taken under the wing of a faithful Christian minister. Right? There's no coincidence to that. That's the providence of God. But there is no Augustine without Ambrose, because it's Ambrose that guides him towards the light. And it's against his own words when he says, to him, this is in the middle of this paragraph that you have before you, to him, as in Ambrose, I was led by thee without my knowledge, that by him I might be led to thee in full knowledge. right? So here he's confessing, he's acknowledging to God that it's you, that in your providence and sovereignty, though I didn't see that at the time, you led me to Ambrose in order that Ambrose might lead me fully to you, right? We never know how those things might play out in our life. We never know who we might be actually leading in those respects. And the inherent virtue and honour and friendliness of Ambrose is what essentially creates the man and the figure that we now know as St. Augustine of Hippo. Right? So, continuing on, in August of 386, after about 2 years of his time there in Milan and of course his friendship with Ambrose, it was upon hearing a reading of a very recently published biography of quite a well-known Christian from this time coming out of Egypt known as Anthony the Great, or Anthony of the Desert. A number of they're known as the Desert Fathers in Egypt during this time. It's the rise of monasticism, which is a different subject. But a biography of Anthony of the Desert, Anthony the Great, one of the Desert Fathers, had been published, and Anthony was a very faithful man, endured hardships during his life, and his biography had been published and had become effectively a bestseller by this particular point. But nevertheless, it's because of this, obviously 2 years of influence from Ambrose, and now after hearing a reading of the biography of Anthony of the Desert, he now begins to narrow in and really kind of move toward Christianity. And in fact, he actually identifies that as one of the driving things that actually converted him, Augustine, into Christianity itself. He recounts in his Confessions how he was brought to tears by this particular reading that he heard publicly, and how the honourable and virtuous life of this man and his faith and fidelity to God. However, Augustine's problem was that despite having abandoned Manichaeism, he still, all the way up until this point, was living an extremely hedonistic life. One of the things that plagued Augustine heavily during that first 30 years of his life as a youth and then as a young man was rampant, wild hedonism, right? Which was a relative feature of certain philosophical schools, others not so much at all. It depended on what's what, as well as just individuals. But in his case, Augustine, during his youth and his days as a young man, was a wild boy, right? A philanderer, an adulterer, a womanizer, and everything else in between. Parties and way too much wine and everything else. And this was this kind of hedonism, which was very much part of his philosophical outlook on the world and his worldview, was something that still very much plagued him in that kind of respect, or in that kind of regard, nonetheless. So he recounts in the Confessions that one day, during kind of all this thing, again, shortly after him hearing a reading of the biography of Anthony of the Desert, he was actually outside in the garden of his home. Wealthy Roman thomas or homes would have a garden out in the back. They would have an internal space with a fountain and a pool usually, and I won't bore you with Roman architecture, even though it's beautiful, but wealthy prominent domas or houses would have quite a resplendent garden, backyard as we might consider them, okay, for hosting of guests, for quiet time, reading and meditating and whatever else. He was out in his own back garden one day, again, in an aristocratic home, of course, that he lives in. And for whatever reason, he was overwhelmed. He recounts this in the Confessions, but he was overwhelmed just by the aimlessness of his life at this point, philosophically. Overwhelmed. Again, he is in a really good position, professor of rhetoric, blah, 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 is close friends with very prominent people in Rome and in Milan as well, particularly, but is just overwhelmed by the aimlessness of his own worldview and his own beliefs, his inability to shake off his long-standing hedonistic past, as it were, and all of this is just frustrating him to no end. And he's actually out in his back garden in tears, essentially on his knees. knowingly or unknowingly, he echoes kind of famous words from Psalm 13, verse 1. How long, Lord, or how long, O Lord, will you turn your face away from me? He kind of cries out in anger in this sense, wanting to be redeemed from his own sin and his own slavery to hedonism, but having no blues clue as to how on earth that could even come about and do that. During this time and during this little kind of incident, from the neighbouring house, he hears either, and he doesn't know who it is. He says it's either a boy or a girl. It's hard to tell, obviously, with young kids. Sometimes young boys' voices are obviously sounding very similar to young girls. But he hears either a young boy or a young girl, a child anyway, singing a chant. He hadn't heard the chant before. There's some speculation as to whether it was well known or not, but that's another subject. Anyway, Dele lege, or in this particular case of tole lege, which simply means take up, read it. And this child was kind of singing this in a kind of melodic way, and why that would be going on, he's not sure, and he doesn't know in his confessions when he's writing it. But this child is singing over and over and over again, tole lege, take it, read it. And he's kind of going, take what, read what, and he's taking it kind of as a sign of divine intervention. And these things happen. Obviously, we've got to be careful to not fall into superstition. But in these kinds of cases, God does work in providential ways, and indeed those providential ways can at times be odd or mysterious to us in the moment. Taking this as divine intervention, as anyone in the ancient world kind of rightfully would, especially in this moment, he's cried out in a prayer, how long, Lord, blah, 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 and then he hears this chant coming from a child, take it, read it, and he's thinking, what do I take and read? So naturally, the only thing he thinks of is he thinks of his mother, Monica, who had very consistently and frustratingly, to no end, tried to bring him into the faith, but to no avail. He thinks of his mother, and then thinks of course, naturally the Bible. And so he goes and grabs a Bible that he has, and takes it and uses a kind of a common form of divination in the ancient world, especially among the Greeks and the Romans, which is, it's essentially where you would take a scroll or a codices, so in other words, books essentially are prominent by this point. Christians not literally inventing the codex, but essentially basically developing the very notion of a book. It's Christians who largely pioneered and did that. If you like reading books, you can thank Christianity. But this form of divination is where you would quite literally just simply flick through the book and just land on something and open it and read it as a sign of divine intervention. This and whatever passage you land on or whatever text it is will have some meaning of some kind. It's obviously not a practice that's commended or recommended in the Bible, but again, as a pagan, it's understandable that he did this. He nevertheless lands in Romans chapter 13 in verses 13 and 14, which read as follows. Let us walk properly as in the daytime, not in orgies and drunkenness, and not in sexual immorality and sensuality, not in quarrelling and jealousy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh to gratify its desires. If you've been paying attention to what I've been saying about his rampant hedonistic lifestyle, it should be blindingly obvious the specific relevance that this would have to him, right? Now, obviously, this is toward the tail end of Romans chapter 13. It's kind of the middle to tail end portions of this particular chapter. Romans 13, the beginning of it's talking all about righteous government and what kings should be doing to rule righteously and blah, blah, blah. It then transitions into this portion here, in this second half of the book of Romans chapter 13, where and it mentions these kinds of things. Again, personal kind of instructions and warnings that the Apostle Paul is giving about morally virtuous lifestyle, blah, blah. But the wording of this, let us walk properly as in the daytime. Right, so in the light, which is why that same imagery of light is associated with him in paintings, right? Let us walk as properly in the daytime, in other words, in the light, not in orgies and drunkenness, which he himself was extremely familiar with, not in sexual immorality and sensuality, which he was extremely familiar with, not in quarrelling and jealousy, which he was extremely familiar with, right? All six of these vices, all six of these sins, he had drunk the fullness thereof, literally and figuratively. But rather put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh, the lust of the flesh, like we saw today in our sermon, to gratify its desires. Like, this is an absolutely just picture perfect passage warning against the destructive power and consequences of hedonism and of sensuality and of the endless pleasure seeking which Augustine himself was drowning in, which our society now is drowning in, and is an absolute enslavement to hedonism. And so the fact that he lands on this is essentially, again, it's not necessarily a commendation of this use of divination, because of course we're warned against divination, but it is God using means and mechanisms that the pagan Augustine, at the time pagan Augustine, would actually understand and be familiar with. He takes this as a blindingly obvious sign of divine intervention, and it is. It's a very obvious one. It's so to chalk this all down to pure coincidence would be far beyond the pale of what would be reasonable. And this is what converts him. This warning, and not just a warning. It's a warning and a call to duty. Right? It's a warning and an admonition, and also a call to action. Right? Walk in the light. Right? Walk properly. Right? So in other words, orderly in the daytime, or in other words, in the light, not in the darkness of sexual immorality and hedonism and debauchery, etc., 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 which simply, which make no provision for the flesh. They don't actually satiate the flesh. It's just a never-ending cycle of trying to satiate the lust of the flesh, like we saw today, alongside the lust of the eyes and the pride of life, but it never achieves it. It's a false, empty, hopeless promise of seeking constant self-gratification, the gratification of our desires, hence the lust of the flesh, right? This passage could not be more relevant to Augustine during this time in his life, in his early 30s, if it tried. And so rightfully taking this as the clear sign of divine intervention, he converts to Christianity. So, he was baptised, and also actually along with his son. He had a child out of wedlock with a mistress of his, that had been, he had many mistresses, but this particular mistress of his had actually been with him. It was his favourite, the person who he deeply loved. It's unclear in his confessions whether he considered himself in his head married to her, but that's kind of largely irrelevant. She had been with him in Carthage, she'd been with him in Rome, she'd been with him in Milan. They had a child together. Adiodatus is his name. Adiodatus, as you could just simply say in English. So Augustine and his own son Adiodatus were both baptised there, and they're actually baptised by Ambrose in the cathedral there in Milan on Easter, which was the 25th of April 387. So he was baptised at the Easter service, he and his son. A year later, he actually departs Milan and goes back to his native homeland of Africa, himself being of Berber origin. The Berbers are the kind of indigenous people of North Africa. They've been entirely subsumed into the Arabs who conquered them in the days of the Umayyad Caliphate in the 7th and 8th centuries these days. But the Berbers were all previously, prior to that, pagan and then became Christian until they were conquered by the Muslims. He goes back to Africa, goes back to Numidia, the province of Numidia specifically. His mother, Monica, was fortunately blessed by God to see her son finally convert to Christianity, and she actually passes away a year later, just of old age. But God granted that subtle mercy to her of, I'm sure, what was in no doubt decades and decades and decades, 30 plus years of constant prayer and intercession for her son, her wayward, rampantly rebellious son, and God extended the mercy to her, or the grace to her of finally witnessing her son come to the faith that she had, and then she passes away a year later. I mentioned also that his father Patricius in the introduction, who had been a pagan, also converted on his deathbed. Okay. And so Augustine would again see his mother and father one day, just as we will meet them. Sadly and tragically, his son actually dies also around this time. As a child, dies of illness. I'm not sure what. There might be some sources, but I haven't encountered any. But nevertheless, his son dies as well. So, of course, there's the tragedy of his own mother and his son dying. However, of course, his mother had been a Christian for life. His son had just been recently baptised into the church, into the faith. And so despite the sadness and the tragedy of his mother and his son's passing, he nevertheless, of course, rightfully had hope and holds hope, and held hope that he would see them again, and that their souls were in the safe caring of God, as indeed they are by virtue of that baptism. Kind of over the course of the confluence of years, he would sell off a fair amount of his wealth that he'd inherited, and giving to the poor. Of course, he comes from an aristocratic family. He felt compelled to do that, and giving it to the poor especially. So very much along the kind of ethos that we saw from John Chrysostom as well, key issue for him. He keeps the family house in Thagaste in Numidia, right, the aristocratic doma that they had, the home, but eventually later on actually converts it into a monastery for him and his friends, right, a number of his brothers in the faith, and so that he can share that quite wealthy, large, noble house with his fellow Christian brothers. In the year 391, he was then ordained as a presbyter in the church of Hippo Regius, hence where we get the name St. Augustine of Hippo. Okay, Hippo, not to be confused with the animal. Hippo Regius, or just simply Hippo, was a coastal city, right? A city on the coast of the Mediterranean, there in the province of Numidia, along the coast west from Carthage. What today is the city of Vernaba in Algeria. He heavily, just like with many other figures that we've seen, from John Chrysostom to Athanasius to Justin Martyr and many others, he utilises greatly that academic background that he had. Right, so the skills that God had developed in him and the gifts that God had given him, even in his evil and wicked life, now were redeemed also alongside of him. Now he used them not for wasteful things, but actually for the good and betterment of God's people, of the church. And so that academic background became extremely important in his life. He, of course, was a master of rhetoric and of philosophy, and the ability to then preach and teach was almost unparalleled. If John Chrysostom had not ever lived, we might say that Augustine was one of the greatest preachers and teachers of all time. But nevertheless, his power and his ability rhetorically to communicate complex truths in understandable ways was right up there with many of the other greats during this early church period and throughout the history of the church, really, in total. He combats many different heresies. Of course, the Arian heresy is still floating around. There's the rise of Nestorianism during the latter end of his life. He lives till the year 430, so dies at the age of 75. So, of course, we saw that the first council of the Council of Ephesus in 431, a year after his death, was convened to deal with the issue of Nestorianism, which had already been kind of rolling out and going on for about 10 to 15 years leading into that Council of Ephesus in 431, which you can check out in previous lessons of ours here. He combats all the various different mystery cults and the false religions, including, of course, kind of historic Roman paganism, pardon me. But one of the most ardent enemies that he combats, of course, is the Manichaeans, and just systematically destroys Manichaeism as a mystery cult and as a philosophy, as a belief system entirely, and droves of people, as far as we can tell, kind of convert out of Manichaeism into Christianity because of his writings. As a former Manichaean himself, now a Christian presbyter or a minister, in other words, a pastor slash elder. He then, in 395, kind of a couple of years after that point, having been a presbyter for about 4 years, is then ordained as the Bishop of Hippo. Okay, and so from 395, he remains bishop until his death, of course, which was the custom. And so across that 35-year period, he spends there as the Bishop of Hippo. Obviously, if we were to detail all the things he did during his time, we'd be going through all the works, and we'd be diving into that year-long course on Augustine, as you can do it in academic circles. But nevertheless, to kind of summarise the latter end of his life, he then passes away on the 20th of August in the year 430, at the age of 75, as I mentioned, and is without question widely regarded, even among non-Christian scholars in the modern day, as one of the greatest bishops and theologians and philosophers in the history of Christianity, quite frankly. To this day, he remains the most prolific author in this period of the early church, ahead of even John Chrysostom himself. There is no one whose writings we have more of extant to this day than St. Augustine. Across his life, there's an estimated range, depending on how we subdivide certain texts, as well as ones that inevitably have been lost but are indicated in other writings, and so we don't have the literal sermon or the work, but it's estimated that he preached somewhere between 8,000 to 10,000 sermons. That's essentially, and again, across the period, if we say that begins in 391 when he first becomes a presbyter, which it would have, you're talking 39 years, right, between 391 and 430 AD. Let's just round that up and call it 40 for simplicity's sake. So 40 years of preaching and teaching. If he was doing it every single week, you're talking, nearly half a dozen or so sermons a week, roughly speaking. It's a lot. It's kind of 3, 4, 5, 6 sermons every single week in, week out, basically, if not more, if you weren't working on doing it every single week, all 52 weeks of the year. So just an incredible, the only person who's ever really, at least that I'm aware of, the only person who has reached anything close to that number would be Charles Spurgeon, the famous 19th century English Reformed Baptist minister, so recently, who is also one of the greatest rhetoricians and preachers in the history of Christianity as well, kind of alongside figures like John Chrysostom and others. But yeah, astronomical amounts. Only about 500 of those sermons have survived to this day, right across the course of 1600 years now, later on. But we have those estimated ranges from obviously the time in which he was ministering, as well as the references to other works of his that are done. So that's why there's a range to that estimation. You can find any academic source will say anything really between 6 to 10,000 or 8 to 10,000, roughly speaking. And his actual written works, like concerted academic works or ecclesiastical works, etc., number into the hundreds. There's hundreds of those works, and many of them, just to give you a couple of his more famous ones, because again, there's you're talking hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. At least as far as I would be concerned, and probably most of my fellow theologians would think this is a reasonable summation of the list. If you had to point to 4, I would at least point to on Christian doctrine, on the Trinity, the Confessions, which we've had reference here today, and probably his single most famous, other than the Confessions, is the City of God, De Civitas Dei, the City of God. The first one's more of a systematic theology. It goes through a variety of different things, including, if my memory serves me correctly, the Apostles' Creed, and explains Christian doctrine and various different points of Christian doctrine alongside of that as well. On the Trinity, again, fairly self-explanatory. Augustine was a staunch defender of the Trinity. He never featured in any of the church councils. He's obviously 391 to 430 is kind of an interluding period, an intermediate period between the Council of Constantinople in 381 and the Council of Ephesus in 431. So he actually doesn't live through any time in which an ecumenical council arises. There are some other councils that he's part of, but none that reach the ecumenical stature, right? Worldwide councils. But nevertheless, despite that, he was a staunch defender of the Trinity. Wrote some of the most important work explaining and defending the Trinity from the Scriptures, and so On the Trinity by Augustine is one of the most important sources of any Christian writings for the Trinity. The Confessions is what we have had, well, like I said, we had quoted earlier. The Confessions is his autobiography, so he writes it himself, of course, autobiography. Quite lengthy, I think. I think the Confessions, I've read through them through college, but I would have to go back and look at exactly how long. You're talking hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages. I think, if my memory serves me correctly, the Confessions is somewhere around 500 pages, and then the City of God's even larger. I think the City of God is somewhere around 700 to 800 pages. The City of God was written. He wrote that in the aftermath of the Gothic sack of Rome in 410 AD. Okay, so in 410 AD, the Gothic barbarians, the Germanic tribes, invade down through the Italian peninsula and actually breach Rome and sack the city. This was the first time in 800 years that a foreign army had stepped foot in the city of Rome. Okay, ever since the days in which Brennus and the Gauls sacked Rome in the year 390 BC. Right? So it was 800 years to the year that a foreign army had ever sacked Rome or stepped foot in Rome. As you can imagine, this was a world-altering experience. We've touched on things before, especially in some of those early lessons. Rome was considered Aeterna Roma, the eternal city, the eternal Rome. The city that would be, as the name suggests, Aeterna, forever. Rome would never end. Rome would stand forever, because Rome had stood since its foundation in 753 under its eponymous founder Romulus, 753 BC, sorry. And other than its sacking under Brennus and the Gauls, the Celts, in other words, the Western European Celts, in 390 BC, not only had no one not only had no one stepped foot in Rome, no one had dared to step foot in Rome. And so when this happens, and it's basically the beginning of the end for Rome, because of course all of basically 70, not even 70 years later, the Western Empire collapses in 476/480, depending who you date it to. This was a world-altering experience for everyone in the world. It was something that was thought to be impossible, and then when the Goths did it, their world changed with it. The city of God that's in reference is contrasted with the city of man, Rome being the city of man. And to give you a gross oversimplification of what the city of God is about, it compares the city of God, the heavenly kingdom, the church, right, which is an unshakable kingdom which Christ has founded, which lasts eternally through the ages, which is the true eternal city, the true eterna civitas, right? It's contrasted with the city of man, Rome, which he, with great sensitivity and empathy and sympathy for those in the western part of the empire, especially in Rome, whose entire world has been turned upside down by this event, he's trying to comfort them with the reality that Rome will fall. It's kind of quasi-prophetic, but you had to be an idiot at this point to not realise that Rome was going to collapse. And Augustine was certainly wise enough and sagely enough and discerning enough to realise that Rome was going to end soon, and he was right, because it ended that century. The city of Rome will fall. Right, the city of man, and he uses that as an analogy for all of the paganism of the world, right? The paganism, the city that mankind has built for itself, the pagan empires of the world, right? It will fall because the city of God will conquer the city of man, right? It's this great eschatological hope of the kingdom of God, the Civitas Dei, the city of God, going forth and eternally spreading through the world and lasting forever, right? all of Augustine's works are brilliant. By far, at least in my estimation, from at the popular level, so the non-academic or non-theological level, the two most important works of Augustine for any Christian to read would be the Confessions and the City of God. The Confessions give you an incredible insight into Augustine the man and the saga of his life, the odyssey of his salvation, his conversion, all of those things, just filled with just pouring his heart out. An incredible read that is by definition and default encouraging and helpful for literally any Christian to read. The City of God is arguably his magnum opus. That would be up for debate, but it's one of, if not his greatest work. It's definitely one of his greatest, if not his greatest work, and points to the single most incredible writing of anyone during this time period of the fall of the empire that was meant to last forever. And of course, the fall of the Western Roman Empire is one of the single most significant events in the history of mankind. It changed the course of Western history forever, and by extension the history of the world forever. And his insight and his wisdom and his theological exposition of the scriptures in applying it to that historic event of the sack of Rome in 410 is something that then really actually translates and transcends across all time, not just simply looking back and understanding, this historical event, but for those who live through times of civilizational decline and or impending collapse, with the same level of humility as Augustine does in the City of God, which I myself try and highlight is the most likely thing that will happen to us in this century or the next, the City of God could not possibly be more relevant to Christians than the 21st century. It's been relevant to all Christians. The last time it was most relevant was the collapse of the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantines, the Byzantine Empire, when they were conquered by the Ottomans in 1453 with the fall of Constantinople. That changed their world. Civilizational decline in the West is and will change our world, and the City of God could not possibly be more relevant. It is more relevant now in the 21st century than it has ever been since the 5th century, in the West at least. I can heartily recommend to you the Confessions and the City of God. Of course, all the other works, like those mentioned as well, on the Trinity and on Christian doctrine, will teach you more than you can ever hope to learn. Will teach you bomb loads. But the Confessions and the City of God, in two very different ways, if I had to recommend anything from Augustine, it's that. So, I'll leave you with an opinion that was proffered by Demon McCulloch, who was and I think still is to this day the professor of the history of the church at Oxford. I believe it's St James's College or one of the others, but anyway, at Oxford University nonetheless. Quite a prolific ecclesiastical historian. An interesting work of his is where I'm referencing this from, but quite a significant work. He opines in that academic work the following about Augustine. Quote, Augustine's impact on Western Christian thought can hardly be overstated. Only his beloved example, Paul of Tarsus, in other words the apostle, has been more influential, and Westerners have generally seen Paul through Augustine's eyes. Okay? So from his 2010 work, that comes from. St. Augustine of Hippo is, without any shadow of a doubt, one of the single most influential philosophical sources in the history of Western civilization. He is also, at least kind of pound for pound, if not even just in total, there is a gigantic argument to make, and in fact many theologians throughout Christian history have made this argument, that of every theologian that has ever been in the history of Christianity, no one has had more of an impact than Augustine of Hippo, because of how many great theologians after him were directly inspired and assisted by his works. Right? In terms of just sheer volume and sheer influence, There really is no one, this is a pretty safe statement to make, there is no one who has had more of an influence on Christianity in terms of an isolated individual than St. Augustine. In the time after the apostles, obviously, of course. It's not by a country mile. There are plenty of others who have as well, but Augustine is at the apex of that mountain. It's why diving into his works is a venture that would, and in no uncertain terms, take us at least a year. For real, okay? And that's really not an exaggeration. Even just to go through the city of God in the 700 to 800 pages would take us months, okay? Because you're not just reading it blind, like I'm not talking about just reading it, I'm talking about actually studying it and learning it and understanding what on earth he's talking about. That would take us months just to go through De Curitas Dei, the city of God. In his theology, of course, that's present. So there's the ecclesiastical context, right? His theological work, the single most prolific, and then outside and beyond the church, just in civilization generally in the West, he is one of the single most influential philosophers. To this day, in the history of the Western canon, as we refer to it in academic terms, Augustine is mentioned in the exact same sentence as Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, etc., Thomas Aquinas, etc., etc., etc. His impact is absolutely astonishingly massive, even in realms that we might not initially see. One of his most famous contributions, not that he was the first to come up with it, but in terms of developing it in a systematic way, was what we now in Western culture refer to just war theory. Okay, so just war theory, especially formalised in its two principles of jus ad bello and jus ad bellum and jus in bello. Jus ad bellum meaning the right, so jus meaning right, or where we get the word justice from, ad bellum, to go to war, from bellos meaning war. So the right to go to war, what are the righteous biblical conditions that must be met to enter into warfare? Either declaring war on someone else, or defending, etc., whatever the dynamic is. So jus ad bellum and jus in bello, the right in the war. So not only the context of what constitutes a just war, righteous war, but also how your armies, your navies, your air force, now these days your air forces, etc., are to conduct themselves in the battle, in warfare, right? So you might have the right to go to war, but that does not equate that you now just start wholesale massacring villages just because you feel like it, right? So those principles were codified by Augustine. And just war theory is the driving premise. It's been perverted to a degree now, but it's the driving premise of just about every single military treaty in Europe for the last 1,000 years. The Treaty of Westphalia and the Westphalian Order that was codified in the early 17th century, the Napoleonic decrees that came out of the Napoleonic Wars, the Geneva Conventions, the multitude of Geneva Conventions coming out of the late 19th century into the early 20th century, etc., 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 all the way down to modern rules of engagement and standard operating procedures, SOPs, etc., that are conducted in modern warfare. All of it traces its origin in the Western tradition, in Western civilization, to Augustine. So gigantic swaths of international law and jurisprudence are directly coming from the fountain that is St. Augustine. It really is difficult to actually overstate how influential St. Augustine is in the history of Western civilization at large, and by extension, the world now. Right? As I said, heartily recommend to you those two sources of the Confessions and the City of God. The Confessions has more of that personal element, really, really beneficial from a personal devotional perspective, as well as a theological one, but particularly a personal devotional perspective, much easy to jump into in terms of Augustine's works. And then the City of God has a much broader and impactful message of hope amidst seeming defeat and hopelessness, and is also an extremely important work. I can wholeheartedly recommend those two, as well as the other list that you have there also. So, thank you. That ends our lesson on the biography of St. Augustine of Hippo. All right. Anyone have any questions or anything at all related to the material we've looked at? Yes?
What would it, this big silly question, what would it have looked like? Because I've never really thought about the sacking of Rome. And it seems like it was a date, like a definite date. So it wasn't obviously did it happen over years, or was it like a full-on game gone? What did it look like on the ground there?
Yeah, it's very much a momentary thing if you're talking about the sack itself. So I'd have to pull up the specific date, but it occurs in the year 410. By this point, it's been about 30 years, roughly speaking, since the days of the reign of the Emperor Theodosius the Great, who we've touched on in reference to the Council of Constantinople in 381. Since the beginning of his reign, beginning in 380 to 381 there, the Gothic tribes, the Germanic tribes, have been crossing the Rhine west into Western Europe and spreading down even into the Iberian Peninsula. They are, again, they're a loose amalgamation of various different tribes that we call by different names now historically. The Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, the Lombardians, the Burgundians, the Franks, who go on to conquer France, hence the name France comes from Franks, etc., etc. In this case, the Ostrogoths, who are spread throughout what is largely kind of Central and Eastern Europe these days, established the Ostrogothic kingdom in what we call the Balkans today, so like today what is Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, etc., etc., what had been the province of Dalmatia previously. From there, they then, under their most famous king, King Amalric, march across past Venice down into the Italian peninsula and conquer their way down with the aim of conquering Rome. Okay? In this particular instance, they sack Rome, and again, I'm trying to launch into a whole history of the sack itself, because there's a bunch of pretexts that kind of are playing here, as well as the fact that the Huns are actually hot on their heels, and the Huns eventually later on try to sack Rome, except the Pope convinces them not to. But in this case, they sack Rome, and the sack itself is quite brutal. It's not wholesale mass slaughter, but it is very much a taking over of the city. Part of it too is the fact that Rome itself was, at least compared to the former days of its glory, was in quite a pathetic state. The imperial capital was in Constantinople, so it's been, ever since it was moved by Constantine, it's been almost a century now, about 80 to 90 years, since Rome has actually been the capital of the empire, right? Nova Roma was, the new Rome, Constantinople. And Rome wasn't even, by this point of the time of Augustine and then in 410, it wasn't even the administrative capital of the West. Milan was. So the imperial administrative court in the West was in Milan, not Rome. Rome was the city itself I'm talking about was a shadow of its former glory. And so the Gothic sacking of Rome in 410 was really not a gigantically difficult task, quite frankly. But they sacked it, they robbed it blind, plenty were raped and pillaged, of course, through that process. And it's really the instance of that occurring in such a flashpoint like that is why I compared it back to the last and only time effectively, at least in terms of from the Republic onward, when Rome had been sacked in 390, 800 years prior. In that case by the Gauls, by the Celts, under the warlord Brennus. It was the fact of this happening, combined with the fact that it wasn't even the fact of it happening, the notion that it could happen, is what was so terrifying to tens of millions of people in the world at that time. It wasn't just that it happened, it was even the concept that it could happen. Because, like I said, this hadn't happened in 800 years. Do you know what I It was somewhat akin, although it was a bit different. In the history of England, the only thing I can even think to compare would be when Mary and William of Orange, William III, crossed the English Channel with an army, which was effectively the first time that had ever been done since the days of William the Conqueror, had also crossed across the Channel and invaded England. In that case, of course, William was actually invited, but by the parliamentarians to oust John II, the Roman Catholic king. But nevertheless, in this context, it's a big historic thing that hasn't happened in 800 years. You're talking almost a millennia, and more importantly, not just it hasn't happened in a long time. It's the notion that the prevailing thought for centuries and centuries and centuries was that this is impossible. This can't happen. This, of course, it would never happen because it can't happen anyway. And so then that flash of it happening again, like I said, it's a bit of both to answer the kind of core essence of your question. The Gothic tribes have been migrating and conquering their way across the Western Mediterranean world now for decades, and that only continues to increase. The Visigothic kingdom is established in Iberia, in other words, Spain, as well as all these parts of North Africa, including Hippo. The Ostrogoths conquer the preponderance of the northern Balkans and almost the entirety of the Italian peninsula down to Rome and beyond, right? As all the Germanic tribes are now conquering their way forward. So there is that progressional nature, right? And later on that only occurs even more. Eventually it's the Ostrogoths who actually bring about the fall of Rome under King Odoacer. And they occupy Rome again later on in 476, and that's the formal Ostrogothic conquest of Rome. So there's a progressive nature to it. There's this impending sense of the inevitable, but still there's the prevailing belief in the back of the mind that this can't happen because it's Aeterna Roma. And then when all of a sudden Rome is sacked in an instant in 390, that's previous one, in 410 AD, it turns their world upside down. Yeah. So, good question.
Where can we find these works?
Yeah, I mean, PDF versions would be fairly readily available just with a Google search of Augustine Confessions PDF. As usually how you can bring up most of the PDFs. But in terms of like actual books with the work, they would then be. I would have to look. It's been quite a while since I would have physically looked to have to buy a copy. But I would like to think that there are Christian bookstores that still have those. I hope they would. If someone's wanting like a physical copy of Augustine's work, like say The City of God, then come and ask me, and I can look into it and look at some sources that I know and try and find one. Yeah, but other than that, just searching Augustine, The City of God, PDF would bring up at least a PDF version that you could then find online. Yes. Fair enough. Yeah. Okay. It's not surprising that I'm saying it. It would be if there's any Christian bookstore that doesn't have Augustine's work, that bookstore should be burnt to the ground. Because it's quite frankly not worth it. If it doesn't have Augustine's works of anyone in church history, then I don't know what they're filling their shelves with. But anyway, I say that tongue in cheek. So yes, fair enough. Like I'm saying, there would be sources you can buy Augustine's works from. They're easily available. Like I said, fortunately, the most prolific writer of the early church and one of the single most influential minds in the history of Western civilization. So yes, good question. Anything else? We're all good. Wonderful. All right. Thank you.